Hello, my wonderful viewers. Episode of Betty Adams' Embers. Today we ask the question of how the J2 got from the Ring of to the Resolute after Ben Adler sacrificed himself. Here we have the setup. An unknown number of Jupiters are still on the ground at the main camp of the Amber Planet. Victor Dahar is waiting for the last ones to take off. Presumably, as the colony representative, he will be the last to leave. He will strike the tent to make sure everyone else is off safely. However, he sees the J2 fly overhead towards the ring. The J2 lands on the ring. Ben Adler gets Scarecrow to the rejuvenation point, leaving Will, who can't fly the Jupiter, trapped on the ring. Scarecrow and the other robots wake up on the ring. So the J2 is a longish flight from the main camp. Will can't fly, and yet somehow Victor Dahar flew the Jupiter back to the Resolute loaded with colonists after the rest of the Jupiters were destroyed. Once the J2 was safely with Victor, all is perfectly logical, but how did the J ring to the camp? This little plot point is set up too well and referenced too obviously for it to have been bad writing. Instead, we have a scene painted with empty space, a series of rather obvious clues set up to show what happened. And here's my theory. Scarecrow had to have been actively protecting the Jupiter 2 after he woke up on the Amber Planet. There are too many obvious questions placed front and center on the screen for it to have been bad writing, so this is obviously something that they just couldn't show, so they had to give you hints or clues to it. Why? Because given the nature of the scenes they would have had to show, it would have been prohibitively expensive to actually show it with the CGI. So, here's the clues we get. The show just so happens to pan over the top of the Jupiter 2 right before and right after Scarecrow was healed, and the ring awakened the other robots. The J2 took at least half a dozen direct thermal blasts, but it was still space-worthy, because there were no blasts in the first shot, and there were the blasts in the second shot. And a side note here, we know those weren't lightning strike burns because we've already seen what ring-generated lightning strikes do to the Jupiter 2. Namely, nothing. Those marks we see after this shot look exactly like the thermal blast damage we've seen the Chariot and the Resolute take. So, we know that between the time that the Jupiter landed on the ring and between the time it got back to the Resolute, there were robots actively attacking it. But it wasn't destroyed. Every other Jupiter that was attacked by the robots in the following scene was destroyed, so something prevented the robots from destroying the Jupiter 2 after they had begun attacking it. Clue number 2 is that Will Robinson does not know how to fly the Jupiter. This is stated at least 3 times on screen, which is very telling, and most tellingly, it's stated after he and the Jupiter get back to the Resolute safely. Clue 3 is that how then the show makes a point of Victor radioing in and saying he was piloting the J2, and that all the other Jupiters were destroyed and the last of the colonists were on the J2. This is something the show did not have to put in. It's a radioed line. They're not showing you anything, they're dropping hints, so you have to think that everything he said over that radio was important to the plot. Clue number 4 is that Will Robinson and the robots who destroyed the rest of the Jupiters were quite a distance away from the rest of the colonists, even by atmospheric flight standards. So as the crow flies, they were a pretty good distance away. Clue number 5, Victor might have risked his own life to go off Mayday, but the show has not shown him as the kind of guy who would risk the rest of the colonists that we saw, so we can presume they didn't load them up into one Jupiter and fly it out to where Will was. Clue number 6, the Jupiter did not have the capacity to fly itself. It could land, but it couldn't take off without guidance, as it had been established in the show where they need to leave the nameless planet. As Adler stated, Will would have had to wait for a pickup. Clue number 7, Scarecrow had to resort to physical violence to prevent Mohawk from toasting Will Robinson, when Mohawk could have easily just gone around Will. So we know that toasting Robinson is a priority, if not the first priority. If Mohawk had learned about Will from Scarecrow's memories, he should have known from the start that Will was on the Jupiter and tried to blast it, which the evidence suggests that he did try to do, but failed. Clue number 8, the fact that the rest of the Jupiters were destroyed shows that the robots were perfectly capable of completely destroying the Jupiters, at least to the point that they made them unspaceworthy. Clue number 9, Scarecrow didn't board the Resolute with the rest of the robots. He didn't come in with that main force, so he probably wasn't working with them. Clue number 10, if a Jupiter is destroyed in flight, everyone aboard would die in the resulting crash, as we saw on the Nameless planet. Since there were survivors, it can be presumed that their Jupiters at least were destroyed on the ground, and most probably they were destroyed with the colonists not in them. And most tellingly, clue number 11, we know that the robots can hack the systems of both the Jupiters and the Resolute. Robot prevented the gun despite the firewalls in the Jupiter system, and Mohawk instantly hacks the Resolute sensors despite its presumably greater defenses. Clue number 12, the Jupiters can be flown from outside as long as there is either a pilot or a navigational system on board that can be communicated with. The J2 had a navigational system. Clue number 13, the end of Season 1 shows that the robots have no trouble scrambling around on the outside of the Jupiters when they are in orbital and suborbital flight. So, somehow the Jupiters got from the ring to the colonists' base without having a pilot, took damage in the attack that destroyed every other Jupiter while surviving with a space-worthy hull, and then made it out of the atmosphere without getting shot down. The timeline makes no sense unless Scarecrow had a hand in it from the moment he woke up. So here is my theory on what happened. Scarecrow was rejuvenated by the ring, and in the process his memories were downloaded to the Silver robots. This was most likely an automatic process that he couldn't stop. Recall how Robot had to physically disconnect from the fragment of the ship to stop the memory transfer with Will. So Scarecrow wakes up fully restored to power, surrounded by 100 other Silverbots who have the first priority of getting something from the Resolute, possibly the engine, and a second priority of blasting colonists. The Silverbots start to take a few shots at the Jupiter too, but Scarecrow defends it, probably by physically jumping on the Jupiter and defending it from there. Recall that blasting Robinsons was only the robot's second priority. In this case, Robot wouldn't have had to actually defend them, he would have had to cost them enough time to make them default to an easier target, namely the other colonists taking off from the base camp. So the Silver robots depart to destroy the other Jupiters. Presumably, they took the first few Jupiters out of the air to the death of all on board, at which point Victor Dahar, who was monitoring this from the command tent, would have ordered every other colonist out of their Jupiters. To evacuate their Jupiters. This would explain how they survived. The Silver robots would have just had time to destroy all of the parked Jupiters before defaulting to their primary goal when Scarecrow, having hacked the Jupiter 2 from the outside, lands on the smoking remains of the colony. Victor Dahar, on seeing the Jupiter 2 land, would have ordered the survivors on board the J2 without question. He would be in such a rush he wouldn't have questioned how Will flew the Jupiter to the camp and presumably didn't spot Scarecrow wherever Scarecrow was, presumably on the outside of the Jupiter's hull. Victor then would pilot the Jupiter back to the Resolute, presumably while the Silver robots are doing a quick circle of the other camps to make sure they got all the unguarded Jupiters. That would give the J2 that 18-minute lead it needed to get back to the Resolute. Then, when the J2 docks with the Resolute, Scarecrow takes off on some mission of his own before showing up at the last minute to keep Mohawk from turning Will into a Krispy Kreme. So, that, my wonderful viewers, is my question and my theory. That Scarecrow was busily protecting the J2 and the rest of the colonists on the ground, and the creators chose not to show it because showing that many robots running around doing their thing would have been prohibitively expensive. There's no way they had the time or the money to put that much CGI, especially not when they had to do the final battle, which was a much more personal visual thing. So, what do you think? Leave a like if you agree and leave a comment atomizing my arguments if you disagree. Peace out, my wonderful viewers.